What makes humans different from other animals? Many would say intelligence, but plenty of animals are intelligent. They use tools, they communicate, they even display emotions we recognize in ourselves. So, why is it that no other species, as far as we know, has developed anything like human language? Some believe language is just an evolutionary accident, an unintended byproduct of growing brains. Others argue it was inevitable that as soon as we started cooperating in groups, words were bound to emerge. But neither of these explanations fully accounts for one strange fact. There is no clear dividing line between a grunt and a word, yet at some point we crossed that threshold. How? And most importantly, why? If we are going to discuss the origins of language, we should first answer a more fundamental question. What even counts as language? Is it simply the ability to communicate? If so, then birds, whales, and even bacteria could be said to speak in their own way. Birds sing to attract mates. Whales produce complex vocalizations. Bacteria communicate with each other using chemical signals. But none of these are what we consider language in the human sense. So, what makes human language different? Is it the added dimension of emotion? Consider this. Imagine we found an ancient civilization, millions of years old, where every member could communicate emotions and intentions perfectly through body language alone. No words, no grammar, just gestures. Would we call that language? Now, unlike animal communication, human language is generative. It can produce an infinite number of new sentences from a finite set of words. This is called recursion, and it is one of the most distinctive features of human language. No animal system has been observed to do this. Other than recursion, there is symbolism and abstraction. A word like tree doesn't resemble an actual tree, but we all agree that it refers to one. Human language operates on arbitrary symbols, while most animal communication is directly tied to immediate needs or reactions in the present moment. For example, a cat purrs to signify content, or a bird sings to initiate mating. Sounds are produced in the same moment they are needed, which ties to the next point. Language allows us to talk about things that are not in the present moment. We can discuss the past, imagine the future, and even construct completely fictional realities. This feature is also known as displacement. No other species appears to do this. So one could say that some of the distinguishing features of language are recursion, symbolism and abstraction, and displacement. With this in mind, the real question isn't just when humans started to make noises, but when those noises stopped being simple signals and started forming complex, meaningful structures. So, how did language emerge? There are many competing theories about how language started, each offering a different perspective on the problem. Some argue that language evolved as an extension of bodily gestures. Others believe that it emerged from music and rhythm. And some even suggest that it was never really created at all, but rather something that we stumbled into through social necessity. One of the most compelling theories is that early human communication did not begin with speech at all, but with gestures. Apes, our closest relatives, rely far more on their hands than on their voices to communicate, and early humans may have done the same. Our distant ancestors likely moved through the landscape communicating only through movement, pointing, waving, miming. Think about it. Gestures are precise, intentional. A hand reaching towards an object means something unambiguously, but sound? Sound is fleeting. It can be abstract and volatile. And so it may have been that we first shaped meaning with our hands before our throats ever formed words. But here's the thing, gestures only work when you can see them. They fail in darkness, in the hunt when your hands are occupied, across distances. And so perhaps out of necessity, sound emerged, not as a replacement for gesture, but as an extension of it. Now, it's easy to imagine that once we decided to speak, it simply happened. But evolution doesn't work quite like that. A chimpanzee cannot be taught to speak, not because it lacks intelligence, but because its body is not built for it. Speech is not merely thought translated to sound. It's a perfect orchestration of breath, tongue, lips, ears, and vocal cords all working in perfect synchrony. The first crucial shift came in the larynx, our voice box. Unlike other primates whose larynxes sit high in the throat, the human larynx is lowered. This anatomical quirk allows us to produce a greater range of sounds, but at a cost. It makes us uniquely vulnerable to choking. It's extraordinary, really. At some point in our evolutionary past, natural selection deemed that the ability to speak was worth the risk of dying from swallowing the wrong way. Other anatomical adaptations included a modified ear structure to allow hearing a wider range of sounds, increased voluntary control of the diaphragm muscles, and so on, so that it was possible to produce a wider range of sounds as well. Consonants are a distinguishing feature of human communication. Other animals, in comparison, are capable of producing mainly vowel sounds. Perhaps attempts to produce complex sounds preceded this evolutionary adaptation as humans started living together in larger groups. Now, these and other theories fall in the camp of continuity theories, which envision language emerging gradually from pre-linguistic systems in our primate ancestors alongside anatomical adaptations. A minority supports discontinuity theories, championed by Chomsky, who is one of the most influential figures in linguistics. Chomsky believed that a single genetic mutation happened about 100,000 years ago and suddenly gave rise to language. In other words, that language emerged in an instant and in perfect form. But this notion is heavily debated and generally rejected by biologists, given that, for one, it defies the slow and gradual nature of evolution. Now, there is more to language than vocal cords and gestures. From a linguistic and cognitive standpoint, the emergence of speech is tied to unique human mental abilities. It hinges on cognitive capacities like memory, abstraction, and social intelligence. Humans can deliberately recall and rehearse memories or imagined scenarios, not to mention that we have an unparalleled capacity for symbolic thought, understanding that words and gestures can represent objects or ideas not physically present. Crucially, language is a social tool, and its evolution was likely propelled by our ancestors' social life and cooperation. Human infants begin communicating with gestures, like pointing, before they could speak, and they do so with clear intent to share information, like a baby may want you to see the cute puppy on the street. Chimps, on the other hand, do not point things out for the sake of sharing. They might point to ask for food, but not to show a friend something interesting. So there is this intent component to human communication and the desire to socialize and share information. Now, the exact mechanism of how speech and language emerged are not entirely known. There are countless theories accounting for different perspectives, from anthropology to cognitive and neuroscience to cultural and historical theories, archaeology, you name it. There wasn't a way to document speech, and we can only speculate based on archaeological evidence of changes in the skull anatomy that allowed speech to happen, understanding of neuroscience, and wherever available, ancient DNA that stores the genetic shifts that eventually supported speech capacities, but also remnants of tools used to teach and transmit information, arguably through the medium of language. Conveniently, writing lagged far behind spoken language. According to archaeological evidence, symbols were used to record information around 8,000 years ago, long before true writing systems, while speech is estimated to have developed around less than 200,000 years ago. But collectively, scientific theories of speech origins converge on the idea that multiple pressures, biological, cognitive, social, drove a transition from primitive communication to the rich language we now take for granted. But why did we start speaking anyway? I mean, it sounds like several 100,000 years of evolutionary effort just to end up arguing about the Oxford comma. Well, there are again multiple theories here. One theory suggests that speech arose as a kind of verbal grooming. Our primate relatives spent hours grooming each other to build trust. But humans who lived in increasingly large social groups needed a faster way to bond. Speech became the solution as a way to maintain social ties and to signal trust. But language is not only a tool of cooperation, but also of manipulation. Interestingly, some scholars argue that some primates have a certain capacity for symbolism that they don't ever use in the wild, and that even if they suddenly develop the right anatomical adaptations to make speech possible, they cannot and would not speak for one simple reason, and that is trust. It is thought that some social structure that made trust possible among humans must have preceded or co-occurred with speech to allow the reliance on cheap signals like words. Otherwise, why believe anything anyone says? In this sense, gestures are considered more honest and reliable. They tie to immediate needs in the present. They are harder to fake, unlike sounds. So in that sense, developing speech must have been deemed more valuable to human survival and likely emerged as a tool for social coordination, like to cooperate on hunts and share knowledge and build alliances, not to mention raising children. As human groups grew larger and more interdependent, simple gestures and vocalizations no longer sufficed. So language must have given us a profound evolutionary advantage, because it is one thing to issue a warning cry at the sight of a lion, and completely another to say, the lion was here yesterday, and it might return. But perhaps there is more to it than just that. I could very well imagine that at some point our brains somehow outgrew the simplicity of available means of communication. It's not just that language was useful, but perhaps that the human brain evolved to a point where simple communication could no longer contain the complexity brewing inside it. But how did we think before language? If language gives shape and substance to thoughts, what did thinking even feel like before words existed? Imagine trying to plan a hunting strategy with 0 words. How would you communicate, hey, we should circle around and attack from the back? Do you just wave your arms and hope for the best? Some cognitive scientists suggest that before language, early humans likely thought in something closer to images and emotions, similar to how infants and some non-human animals seem to process information. But once language appeared, it created a new kind of comprehension, one that was structured, logical, and capable of abstraction. In other words, before words, thoughts were immediate. After words, thoughts became narratives. So learning to speak wasn't just about communication. It may have been the moment when humans began experiencing reality differently, remembering past events in more detail, or planning for futures they had never seen. So could it be that language has reorganized consciousness entirely? We didn't just learn to speak, we learned to shape our minds, and perhaps that was the beginning of everything else. If you are interested in a more in-depth exploration of how language shapes thought and the perception of reality, you can check out these 2 videos that I made on the subject.